my name is Mary Butzow. I'm a retired nurse. And for the last 18 months, my husband Charlie and I have been volunteering here at the History Museum. And in this fall, TJ asked me to spearhead a new project that is the Champaign County Digital Newspaper Initiative. The goal of this project is pretty simple. It's to convert into a usable digital format local community newspapers that were published in Champaign County. And it's fairly straightforward. Over the last 50 to 100 years, there have been multiple newspapers in small towns and small communities that didn't tell national news, didn't tell state news. It told the local history, the local news of the community. And there is always a potential of losing these stories without them being shared. This is a cooperative effort. There it goes. It's a cooperative effort between the Champaign County History Museum, the Champaign County Archives at the Urbana Free Library, the Illinois Digital Newspaper Collection at the University of Illinois, the University of Illinois History, Philosophy, and Newspaper Library, and the local communities from which the papers came. The current state of the collections, some of them are on microfilm, which is fairly stable, but difficult to access. And if you've never been to the archives at the Urbana Library looking through the microfilm, you end up in a very dark space with the microfilm on a fairly touchy machine going page by page very slowly. Your other alternative is paper copies, which are very unstable and fragile. And this makes difficult research very difficult, particularly those of us who are now in 2022 used to search engines. We're used to going on the computer and putting in a date and a name and a topic, and poof, there's all your information. Rather than having to know what year you want, pretty much what date you want, and pretty much having to know what you're looking for. Otherwise, you just get some happy surprises on occasion. So what we propose is a process to convert this into this material into a digital format, mostly from the microfilm, using a process called segmentation. And in segmentation, what the digital group does is they take a newspaper article and they take out the name, the date, the topic, and put it into a search engine type format. So when it's put back together again and available online, you can use the search engine of the Illinois Digital Newspaper Collection to search as you would something, for example, on Google. That would then be posted on the Illinois Digital Newspaper Collection, which is at the University of Illinois. And once it's posted on there, users have there's no cost to the user for access. There's no subscription fee. It's open to the public for anything they want to use off of it. Now, we chose to start with Dale Publications, which is a St. Joe record for a variety of reasons. I refer to it as Dale Publications because the St. Joseph Record, which is the paper I grew up with, was also published in several other communities with a different title. So it covered a huge swath of eastern Champaign County and western Vermilion County, because the St. Joseph Record was also published at the same time as the Ogden Courier, the Homer Enterprise, the Fairmount Star, and the Oakwood Township News. It covered news from the communities of not only St. Joseph, Ogden, Homer, but also Fithian, Royal, Flatville, some little bitty places that don't get a lot of recording. It's available. It was published from 1894 to 1980. That's 86 years. And all of this is available on microfilm. Then the microfilm has been judged to be in good shape, which means that you can read it. It's very readable. And the company that's going to do the digitization said that it's very usable. And it's a fairly homogeneous paper. It only had 4 owner publishers over the 86 years. And the last owner publishers I knew quite well, the people in the picture here, that's Bob and Barbara Butler, who were the editors of the paper from 1952 to 1980. And their children, particularly their oldest daughter, Jean, has been very, very supportive of us in this process. Jean and I have been friends since before we started first grade. And so we're very, very good friends. And this is my hometown, so I have a vested interest in seeing that this happens. Now, Jean always wants me to tell people what's the value of the Champaign County Newspaper Digitization Initiative. And basically, we came up with a theme of empowering communities to tell their stories. And what kind of stories are they going to tell? Well, they tell community stories. In the paper, there are village board minutes. There are the meetings of the school board, church meetings. And what crime was reported, there was crime reported in the paper. Social activities, Lions Club, American Legion, the Masons, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Women's Club. And I want to say something special about 4-H clubs. Those of us who grew up in 4-H, the first meeting of the year, they elected officers, and the youngest kid in the club was made the reporter because they didn't know what else to do with you. So the reporter's job was to write down for every meeting where the meeting was held, and who did the demonstration and who did the talk and what we talked about, and that we had refreshments and who was there. And then you sent it to the paper. You sent it to the St. Joe Record because the News Gazette and the Courier didn't want any part of that. So I found out much later in life that Mrs. Butler would very discreetly correct your grammar and your spelling and published it under your byline. So it came out that I belonged to the Blue Mountain 4-H Club, and at the bottom it would say Mary Waters, reporter. So you did have your own byline for at least 6 to 9 months when you were 10 years old. They also covered achievements, scholarships, awards, and sports achievements. Not only did they cover the high school football and basketball for all the communities involved, including ABL, which was Allerton, Broadlands, and Longview, for those of us who've been around for a while, but they also did the grade school basketball. Muncie, which is a practically non-existent community now, there's very few people there, but Muncie used to have a really tough basketball team in grade school, and they are featured in the paper a lot. Also, Bob Butler was really big on Little League. And so in the 60s and 70s, he published everybody's Little League stats, which are the, a friend of mine said it's what you want to brag on to your grandkids about. And they also covered there was a bowling alley that opened in the early 60s, and they published the bowling scores. So if you want to check on your parents' bowling scores, you can. Also, for those of us who are into families and genealogical research, births, weddings, deaths, family reunions listing the people who attended, and birthday parties listing the people who attended were all covered in the St. Joe Record. So if you will bear with me, I thought we'd spend a few minutes tonight with me sharing with you what types of histories you can find in a paper like the St. Joe Record. And because it's December 7th, and 81 years ago was Pearl Harbor Day, I thought we would look at an intimate picture of World War II. Now, it's an intimate picture because the stories I'm going to tell you have to do with people I knew. Some of them are family. Some of them are people I knew around St. Joe and Ogden growing up. Some of them are the fathers of friends of mine or people I went to school with. And a lot of this very rich history is because of this gentleman. This is Charles W. Dale, who was the editor-publisher of the St. Joseph Record and actually created Dale Publications between 1929 and 1951. And I knew Mr. Dale as an ancient man around town. He lived to be 100. And but during World War II, he made sure that any servicemen in the area for whom he could get an address was sent a copy of the St. Joe Record every week. And these guys would write back to him. And so what I have is letters to the editor, essentially, that were sent from guys overseas. And I say guys because 99% of them were men. Very little is said about women in the service in the paper. Now, before December 7th, 1941, There's not a lot in the St. Joe record about the war. There was a war going on in Europe. There was war going on in China and in the Pacific, but not much is said in the St. Joe record until after Pearl Harbor Day. So what was being covered in the paper? Well, if you go back out of the front page into pages 5, 6, 7, back in the back of the paper, you would find as early as June 1940, advertisement calling for people to volunteer for the Red Cross or to send money to the Red Cross. And an ad like this was in the paper just about every week. As I said, very little news about the war was there, but occasionally something would pop up. This was in March 7th, 1941 edition, and it has to do with the famine and the food shortages in Europe. And this would have been very interesting to the local farming community as to the fact that there was a famine as well as the war going on in Europe. So if they weren't covering the war, what were they talking about in the paper? Well, they were talking about small town regular things. And at home in St. Joe in 1941, my parents were seniors in high school in the St. Joe High School. And the paper is full of actual small town things. Now, just a little disclaimer, I have 3 pictures here that actually appear in the St. Joe record, but the quality I got off the microfilm wasn't very good. So I cheated and I went back to the 1941 high school yearbook and took the same pictures out of there, and they're much better. So anyway, here's the basketball team. They did very well that year. And number 5 in the front row is my dad. So that's my dad. And the guy in the t-shirt in the second row on the far right-hand side is the coach, and he will come up later. Also, they had a newspaper, and Dale Publications published their newspaper, as they did the school newspaper until they went out of business in 1980. The high school newspaper was always part of Dale Publications. And probably the most noteworthy thing that happened in the high school in 1941 was that the mixed chorus, under the direction of Miss Blanche Moy, took first in the state and went to the regional competition in Flint, Michigan, where they placed second. So Miss Moy is on the far left-hand side of the picture. My dad is 6 over in the back row, and my mother was the accompanist, and she's on the end. Now, some of you have met my Aunt Esther, who's done a couple of oral histories for the museum this year. She's the 4th one over in the front, 4th from the left in the front. So that's Aunt Esther. But at the same time these kids were enjoying high school, some of their friends were doing other things. Billy Cole left high school and joined the Navy. And this is from March 21st, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. He'd already joined the Navy. And it says here that he was an electrician on the USS Saratoga, which was an airplane carrier, not an aircraft carrier, an airplane carrier is what it was said. Now, there's a connection between Billy Cole and the traction system exhibit downstairs, because his father was the station master of the traction depot in St. Joe, and they lived above the traction depot on Lincoln Street in St. Joe. In that same paper was a picture of Clarence Putnam from Royal, who had also joined the military. He was in the Army. And in the May 2nd, 1941 paper, it mentioned that the draft had started in anticipation of hostilities. And the first person drafted from the area was Warren C. Weaver, who was sent to basic training in Texas. Now, once war was declared after December 7th, 1941, the tone of the paper changes a little bit. The next week, on December 12th, 1941, there's an article about host a soldier for Christmas. Chanute Field was open, and they were encouraging women in the town to bring home a soldier as a family member for Christmas. They also, on December 19th, started a campaign called Remember the Boys, putting together gift boxes of baked goods, candies, toiletries, and books to be sent to people in the service, men in the service. And the boxes got there because in the January 2nd, 1942 paper, the thank you notes were printed from the guys who got the boxes. December 26, 1941, Mr. Dale started printing a regular article called Boys in the Armed Forces. And he would list as a regular feature that the people who had been either drafted or enlisted and where they were and what they were doing. And some name, this is too small a print to read, but there are some names in here that I'm going to refer back to in a few minutes, including Bill Cole again, a guy named Russell Marsh, Stanley Hall, who was the coach of the basketball team. He has now gone to Officers Candidate School, and Chet Hanks and Robert Weaver. From 1942 to 1943, every week there were 8 to 10 feature articles in the newspaper regarding people who were in the service. Either they had enlisted, where they were training, where they were leaving, when they were leaving home, and where they were going. And most of them were moving around the US. Very few of them had been sent overseas yet. But starting the end of 1943, people were really moving out. And this is my dad in September 1943, right before he was shipped to the Pacific with his girlfriend Toots. He was a Navy corpsman, and this is going to come up again later. In 1942, though, in November 1942, Mr. Dale got a warning from the War Department, so he had to adjust how he published the paper. It says, because of restrictions by our government in regard to the publication of any information which might be of value to the enemy concerning the size and movement of troops or the number of men in service from any one community, he was going to discontinue publishing a list of names in Boys Away. However, he makes the point that he will still be sending the record weekly to anyone for whom he had an address. Now, the guys in St. Joe and Ogden and Royal were beginning to see action. Staff Sergeant Chet Hanks, who was the dad of a friend of mine, got sent to India. And I never could figure out why he was in India, but apparently he was with the airplanes. He serviced the airplanes that flew over the Himalayas to go to Burma. So Chet Hanks wrote home and sent rupees, because they look like funny money. So he sent some rupees home, and he asked them to please send toothpaste. So that was what he wanted. Russell Marsh wrote in November 19th, 1943, he wrote his family, a year ago today, I was on my way to North Africa. I didn't have any idea that now I would be in Italy. So he spent a year in North Africa, then he got sent to Italy. And for a 20-some-year-old man, this sounds a little bit like a travel log. They wrote very descriptively of where they were when they could. And I think it's really interesting that he says that I like Italy a lot better than North Africa. It's nice and warm and everything is green and pretty. There's lots of flowers in bloom and there's also plenty of fruit. Apples are ripe and it will only be a few days until the oranges and dates will be ripe. This is a mountainous and hilly country, and little towns dot the hillsides. The towns are really old and look like they've been here for years. Yeah, Russell, what do you think? It's Italy, yeah. Anyway, he said they look like they've been there a long time. The buildings are made of stone and nearly all the houses have balconies. The cobblestone streets are narrow and winding, and I get a kick out of the farmers working the fields with their big white oxen. So you do get a little bit of a travelogue from a 20-year-old's perspective. Here's an example of someone writing home to Mr. Dale. This is from June 24th, 1944. Adolf Wilmes writes, just received a couple of copies of the record, and they're just as newsy as the first ones I got 2 years ago. So he had been in the Pacific for 2 years already, and he kept getting the record, which he really appreciated. Life on this rock, he won't tell you where he's at. Life on this rock is busier than New Zealand. The people were really good to us there and surely enjoyed our short stay after not seeing any civilization for almost a year. So we're not quite sure where he was in the Pacific, and now he's on a rock. I hear from home pretty often. If you have someone overseas, write them as often as they always like to hear from friends and relatives back home. Thanks a million for the ever faithful paper. And then in February 16th, 1945, my dad wrote, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dale, it's hard for me to start this letter because it's hard to find anything to talk about. The censor is rather tough on a person, so if I write too much of the wrong thing, you just get a piece of paper with a big hole in it. And some of his V letters are, dear mom and dad, huge hole, love Bob at the end, because he talked about the wrong things. First of all, I want to thank you for the record. It comes through in fine shape and sure does bring the old hometown closer to me. Of course, there have been some changes here and there, and some of the names are different, but old friends of mine still come into the news. You'll never know what it means to read about the people who were your friends so long ago. So long ago, he'd been overseas 18 months, but when you're 20 years old, it's so long ago. At this point, he was on a destroyer. Now, there are also in the paper what I call happy serendipity, odd things that happened, people who met up with other people. If you think about World War II, thousands and thousands of Americans were in the service and deployed thousands and thousands of miles from home, and they would end up running into each other. Now, St. Joe and Ogden and Royal are not very big towns. And in 1941, the total population was about 1,200 people. But somehow they would find connections far from home. And this is one of the interesting ones. My dad's sister, Esther, that was in the picture of the chorus, when she got out of high school, became a nursing student at Burnham City Hospital. And this says, Miss Esther Waters, junior nurse at Burnham Hospital in Champaign, received a letter the other day, which brought to light some of the surprising circumstances brought about in a global war. The letter was from Signalman David Smith, now with the Navy in the South Pacific, who a year ago had been in the Naval Training School at the University of Illinois. During his training period there, he was a patient at Burnham Hospital following an appendix operation, and Miss Waters was one of his nurses. So I asked my aunt about this, and she said, well, if one of the guys who were in the training schools had to be in the hospital, they kept them in the hospital until they were well enough to stay in the barracks by themselves. So sometimes they stayed as long as 2 weeks in the hospital. Well, you have a young guy in the hospital with all these student nurses, they're going to kind of congregate around him. And I also know that after he was discharged, he took her out a few times. So they were kind of chummy. Anyway, Signalman Smith wrote her that she would never guess where he was and who he had just met. He was in the hospital in a South Pacific area suffering from a blood infection. And the man who was caring for him in the hospital was Robert Waters, her brother. Upon hearing the Waters name, the sick sailor told him that he had been cared for a year ago by a nurse at Burnham Hospital in Champaign, Illinois, by the name of Esther Waters. To which I'm sure my dad rolled his eyes and said, yeah, that's my sister. So it's one of those really odd things that happen. Another serendipity that happened, this Russell Marsh, the guy who wrote from Italy, in 1945 was coming home from Italy back to Miami Beach, Florida for reassignment. And on the ship on the way over, he met Omar Landon, who grew up in St. Joe. And so they ended up in Florida as roommates because they met on the ship coming home. And then in July 20th, 1945, in the paper, it mentioned that a letter written July 7th from Lyon, France, was from Captain Kent Dale, who is Mr. Dale's son, who is a chaplain with the 7th Army. And they had taken over a hotel in Lyon, France for recuperating soldiers who had been injured. And in the lobby one day, he runs into a guy named Orville Maddock, who had been wounded. Well, Kent Dale was about 5 years older than Orville Maddock. So when Orville Maddock went up to him and said, are you from St. Joe? Captain Dale didn't know who he was, but then once he introduced himself, he realized, oh yeah, you were that kid when I was growing up. So although they were 5 years difference in age, Sergeant Maddock and Captain Dale said they went to Captain Dale's room and according to the chaplain's letter, had a bull session until noon. So they talked for quite a while. So again, far from home in France, and you run into somebody you know. About this time in 1944, you start seeing a lot of action. And this is from William Anderson, July 28, 1944. This is about 5 weeks post D-Day. The letter was written July 11th, which was just a month post D-Day. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dale, I have a few minutes time to myself now, so I thought I would write you a few lines. I'm somewhere in France. And it looks somewhat like England. The Germans have made the French let their hedges and trees grow, so it looks kind of wild. Jerry is really dug in deep, and it's awfully hard to kick him out. I received my first record in France yesterday. It was the issue of May 12th, but is most certainly welcome. So even from the front lines, they would write home. In May 1945, right at the end of the war, dear Mr. and Mrs. Dale, I thought this would be an excellent time to drop you folks a few lines and let you know that I am in the very best of health and very happy that the war in the European theater is almost over. I haven't received any of your records for months, but may I say that isn't all your fault, for we have been traveling with the 4th Armored and the mail just couldn't catch up with us. We are very much pleased to know that once again, and perhaps for all, the Germans are thoroughly whipped. People back home do not and probably will never realize what a terrible whipping the Germans and especially their property took in this war. Most of Germany looks like the area north of St. Joe did a few years ago after it was hit by a tornado. And then remember Adolf Wilmes, who couldn't say what rock he was on? The rock he was on was Guadalcanal. And here he is in the Philippines a year later. He's still not home. It's still 3 years. He's still in the Pacific. But the rock he was on at that point was Guadalcanal, and now he's in the Philippines. It wasn't all good news in the paper. The nephew of Mr. and Mrs. Ezra Reese died in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines in October 1944, but they didn't find out about it till January 16th, 1945. Remember, you had to depend on the telegrams from the military. There was no phone service, there was no email, there were no texts. PFC Alvin Bloom was reported missing in France. I do know he ended up in a POW camp, but I also know he got home okay because I went to school with Kelly Bloom's kids. So I know he got home. Now the most complete story I got was about a guy named Fred Landon. Now Fred Landon was a little older than everyone else. He was 31 when the war started, and he enlisted right away and was part of the tank divisions under Patton in France. I didn't know Mr. Landon very well, but I knew his wife exceptionally well because she was my Latin teacher from 1966 to 1968. And she also taught world history and directed all the plays at St. Joe Ogden High School. So I knew Mrs. Landon very, very well, but I didn't know her husband. And apparently on December 22nd, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, he was caught behind enemy lines and was missing in action. And they didn't hear anything about him until January. It was lost in December 22nd. In January, all the War Department said was that he was missing in action. So she had no idea where he was. March 30th, 1945, she hears from the War Department again, and they say, oh, by the way, he was in a prisoner of war camp on the Polish border, and he was just liberated by the advancing Russian army. So if you think about it, the Russians were coming from Russia towards Berlin. The POW camp he was in was on the Polish border, so he was liberated by the Russians. And that he would be home sometime. They didn't say when, they just said sometime he'll be home. So a week later, Mrs. Landon gets a card from her husband that had been written on January 11th saying, I'm in a POW camp, but I'm okay. But she already knew he'd been liberated by the time she got the letter. He got home on April 27th, and the entire town of St. Joe turned out for a party at the high school gym, and it was packed. And he spent the time talking about serving under Patton, about doing reconnaissance for his armored tank division, getting caught behind enemy lines, being taken prisoner, physically marched across Germany. They didn't take him in trains, they marched him across Germany, and that the English and American soldiers were treated quite well in the POW camp, but the Russians were treated abysmally. So he told a complete story by the time he got home, and it is printed in the paper. Things started winding down about then. Billy Cole, who enlisted before the war in 1941, is now a chief petty officer. He's no longer on the Saratoga. He's now working with a group that is taking down the air bases that were built by the Seabees in the Pacific. So he was dismantling air bases. Robert Weaver, who I knew very, very well, he was the postmaster in St. Joe when I was growing up, left home in 1942, May of 1942, to be deployed overseas. He also went to North Africa. He was a ground traffic controller for the Air Corps. He made sure that the planes were able to fly, they had enough fuel, they had enough bombs, they had enough supplies. He said sometimes they were held together really with baling wire and spit, but he got him up in the air. He spent 2 years in North Africa. Then he too was sent to India and eventually got home on May 25th, 1945. Now the article about where he went is interesting, but the bottom half of the entire article is who came to the party at his mother's house, all of his relatives and where they live and who came to see him when he got home. Well, my dad got home on June 22nd, 1945, because his destroyer had been disabled, and they limped back to Bremerton Naval Base, and he came home. And so here's the article about Dad being home on leave, 60 days leave. And by the time he got back to Bremerton in August 1945, the war was over. So they turned him around and sent him back home. But again, honored at the dinner, it tells who showed up to the party. One of the few articles that are actually about the war itself and not something from one of the servicemen was on August 17th, 1945. The type is different. It was bracketed and different. It was separate from the rest of the paper by brackets, and it was that Japan had surrendered. But not everybody got home right away. Herschel Ring, for example, didn't get home from Japan until September 1946. Took him a long time to get home. Now, interesting, starting in 1946, we have wedding, 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 and then baby, 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 which are the people I went to high school with. And one of the weddings was Bob Waters married Toots. Now, I bring up the picture because when you did the World War II exhibit a couple of years ago, there was a couple featured at the very end of the exhibit with her white kimono in the display case, Russell and Helen Landreth, who were surviving after the war, getting Russell through school. Well, I grew up knowing them as Uncle Rut and Aunt Helen because they were my parents' best friends. So there's Uncle Rut as best man and Helen as the matron of honor in my parents' wedding. So that's the kind of things you can find out through small town newspapers. It's just a taste of the available information. It's not an easy job to scroll through the microfilm. It would be so much more comfortable to sit in your own house on your own computer and look things up in a digital database. So I want to encourage people to pay attention to the Champaign County Newspaper Digitization Initiative. It does cost money. It costs between 65 cents and $1 per page to do the digitization. And we've divided it, as I said, into 2 batches. Batch number 1 is about 22,000 pages, and it covers 1940 to 1980. And we decided to do this as batch number 1 for a very selfish reason, because that's where the baby boomers are. And the baby boomers have some disposable income, and maybe they want to donate to get their Little League scores. The second batch is from 1894 to 1939. It's another 22,000 pages, and we estimate it's going to cost about $16,000. And what we're looking for is modest amount from community donors. My friend Jean and I did some calculation, and for the first 16,000, we need 300 people to give $50. We need 600 people to give $25. So we're looking for people to invest in their own community. There's also potential for some grants. Connor's helping us look at grants that hopefully we can start applying for right after Christmas. To date, we started raising money on November 7th, exactly a month ago, November 7th, 30 days ago. We have currently raised $3,000. So we are doing okay. If you want to donate, you can get a special pledge envelope from here at the History Museum. You can also donate directly on the Champaign County History Museum website. There's a place you can donate directly, or on the the Facebook page for the History Museum. And we've also put it, St. Joseph, Illinois has a History of St. Joseph Facebook page, and we put it there for people to donate. This is a very fun project. I've had a lot of fun looking this stuff up for tonight's presentation, and I hope that other people will be as enthusiastic as I am and contribute to this great endeavor. So thank you.